Okay, we're now recording this webinar, and I'd like to welcome you all, and especially Nick Dubois, for this webinar on democracy. This is the second one that we've done with an MP, and the first one worked really well, and we had a lot of participation. And what we're trying to do is look at different aspects of democracy, both nationally and globally, and some of the deficits and what we can do to put that right, what changes needs to be made. Now, Nick is very interesting because this is his first session as an MP, and he has some strong views, and some of those views have been forged by the expectations that he felt when he came in the House of Commons that were not met. I think lots of MPs, when they come in, and I can understand it, are full of enthusiasm about making changes, and then suddenly they hit the system. So I'd like to ask you to start this off, Nick, is when you first became an MP, is it true that you were concerned at the little power that MPs had in relation to the government?
Absolutely. I think you know what you're going to find when you are elected as an MP, but it nevertheless was extremely disappointing to find that I was essentially a legislator without executive power, and I had to use the tools at my disposal to try and influence people or issues to bring about change. You actually don't have any power whatsoever.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think it's happened that way in the British system?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons, but to keep it brief, I think the way Parliament has evolved, particularly over the last 25 years, I would say, if you are a backbencher, you are essentially meant to be lobby fodder. You are meant to be there to support the executive. And actually, for this Parliament, we saw a large range of people who were over 45, 50, had careers behind them, and actually had a greater expectation that they might be able to achieve things differently by coming into Parliament. Of course, there was a clash there, effectively, which points really to why this Parliament's probably been the most rebellious.
Is it a structural problem, or is it that MPs have become increasingly careerists and they're looking for a promotion into the executive rather than being legislators in their own right?
Well, I think I'll try and avoid generalisation. I mean, there are a number of MPs who enjoy and believe passionately about being a constituency MP first and foremost. There are other MPs who have come through a very short political process that has led them to becoming an MP without experience outside of Parliament. And that is, if you like, your typical career MP. Now, I think the House, like everything, balance of different people, but the system is designed to effectively point you towards a career as a minister, and that therefore determines you are unlikely to be independent when it comes to your voting on issues that you might disagree with that the executive put forward, if you're on the government benches, that is.
Just to pick up some questions as they're coming in, John Pittston is the lecturer from Christchurch, and one of his students, James Ayres, who's a second-year politics student, says, is there concern over MPs being dominated by the executive? And why are the whips so influential? Is that the problem?
Well, it's a very good question. I should add, Francis, just for the benefit of those joining us today, I'm also secretary of the 1922 committee, which for Conservative MPs is, if you like, the backbench body that represents backbench MPs. And we, if you like, are sometimes known as the men in grey suits, although I don't own a grey suit myself. But we therefore are representatives of the backbenchers, which I think means we're perhaps a little more sensitive as an officer of the 22 to the role of the executive. But to answer the question specifically, if you believe that you can only bring about change by becoming a minister, then you will fundamentally do what the whips do. Now, the whips are employed, and they are other MPs, they're my colleagues, the whips are employed to get the government programme through. And they will pretty much use any measures that they can. It could be a call to loyalty, which is perfectly respectable. It could be the holding out the opportunity of promotion. All of that happens. What doesn't happen is what you often read about is bullying. That doesn't go on. Maybe it's I'm 6'4" and nobody's tried to bully me, but I don't think that goes on. But there is no doubt that actually your loyalty at votes, even if you disagree with them, is the price you pay for possible promotion up the ladder to ministerial jobs.
A couple of questions that are being asked relates to the next question I'm going to ask you, so I'll ask you that in context. I mean, you believe, don't you, that one way of improving this is to go more and more towards the American system where there is a separation of powers between the executive and the legislative and the judiciary, though the judiciary is separate in this country. I mean, how would that work in this country? How would you get that separation of powers? Would you have a presidential system? How would you make sure that the Prime Minister is not chosen from the House of Commons, for example? How would it work? It's difficult to see it working in the system we've got in this country.
No, it is difficult because the American system that you're referring to has some enormous problems itself. It was designed to be checks and balances, and actually it can lead to almost no progress whatsoever. Let's start with the flaw. If you analyse the Conservative Party now, which has 305 MPs, there are, roughly speaking, about 100 Conservative ministerial positions to be offered. Remembering, of course, we're in a coalition, so there's other jobs that go to the Liberal Democrats. Now, those 100 posts are filled. That leaves us with 200 MPs. Almost certainly, over half of those remaining MPs will want to get into government, which means effectively that we will have something in 80 to 90, maybe 100 MPs who are scrutinising the executive in, shall we say, the most profound way, that they will speak out on issues, challenge legislation, and be prepared to vote against it. It's not something you do easily. And then if you have the opposition doing their job properly, you've got about half of the parliament probably scrutinising what an executive is doing. That's what's uncomfortable about the system, because the role of patronage, effectively, or wanting to get on and develop your career, comes first. Whilst we may not, and I accept, Francis, we may not be able to go straight to the system that the Americans have because of some of the problems you've raised, I think we should look at the potential advantages. After all, a prime minister fundamentally only chooses his cabinet from his 350 MPs if he holds a majority. Now, I have a view that the prime minister should be able to bring into government talented people from all walks of life if he chooses, so long as they can be held to account by the legislature. And at the moment, we don't really have a means of doing that. Our select committees, which are meant to hold the executive to account, although strengthened under this parliament, are still not, I believe, empowered enough to hold someone who is, for example, unelected in the position to account. That
I understand, but would you separate the legislature totally from the executive? Because in the American system, again, that's created problems. I mean, Sean has mentioned one of the usual questions there, or points that often come up about Parliament and the establishment being controlled by corporations and the big banks and so on. Now, in the American system, when you have legislatures who are free from the executive, they're open to lobbying and possibly corruption, and you get gridlock as well, like you did with budget debate, where the government was shut down for 2 or 3 days because no one could make a decision. How do you avoid those pitfalls? Because
I think finance is very. I think finance is really important on this question. One of the problems with the House of Representatives, for example, is they are elected every 2 years. So the minute a House of Representatives is elected, he has to prepare fundraising to get re-elected. By definition, we are talking not by the small amounts of money that are required, that I am limited by law to spend on my own election, which represents the equivalent of something like 20 pence per head of my constituency, and my constituency size is something like 70,000. It's not, you don't need to be a genius to work out what a lot of money. It therefore constrains the influence of funding by outsiders that may lead to some questions over to who are they answering to. Whereas the American system, it's hundreds of millions of dollars that get poured in the minute someone is elected. I think that's where you have a problem with corruption. So I think that's money, not necessarily the system that we have of legislator and executive. So is a separation of powers possible? Yes, I think it is. If the chamber was the legislator, the executive would bring legislation to the chamber for approval, and they would answer through a set of powerful select committees. The ministers would answer through a set of powerful select committees as to their intent of the legislation and whether it deserves the party's support.
Oliver Fawcett has, I think, given you a sort of hands up by saying Canterbury students seem to agree allowing the PM to choose talented individuals from the cabinet once they're held accountable. So that's a view that obviously they discuss at Canterbury, and it's a view that they share with you. Yeah. But Oliver and a lot of people, it's the same person that sent the question, Oliver Fawcett. I mean, he's saying we should make some other changes as well. And he says and by the way, as I'm saying this, everybody else, please start asking your questions now. Feel free to do that. But he's saying that we maybe should make some other changes. And he's looking at the role that MPs play. He's saying they legislate on one hand, and they also represent their constituencies on the other. Is there any way of dividing that up? Because in some ways, they're not incompatible, but the constituency role takes a lot of time. He's suggesting maybe there should be two houses, one for dealing with constituency matters and one for dealing with legislation. I don't know if that's possible, but that's one suggestion he has. But there is that sort of, if you like, time conflict on your time of those two roles.
Yeah, well, that's a really big question, but I will try and limit the answer, maybe provoke some discussion on it later. First of all, I personally would never want to see the break between a constituency MP and his election. So that's why I support the first past the post system and believe that people should have the right to either kick me out or keep me for another term if I stand, based on the work I do both in Parliament and in... Yeah, that's effectively how the MP's role has now changed. So that in the constituency, I've become another point to try and influence change in people's cases or circumstances, which means I either work to pressurise or influence the agencies that, if you like, are responsible for housing, education or whatever. Now, in a way, that's a good thing because it keeps us very close to the constituents, but it does obviously cut into the amount of time we might spend in our conventional role as legislators or trying to introduce new laws or changes. Now, do I think that should change? Well, I think that the answer to that is perhaps the level of government at a local level needs to change so that we look at our councillors. How much time, how active can they be in actually scrutinising and assisting constituents with the issues that they have responsibility for? Housing, schools, education. And I think unless that changes, it's almost impossible to roll back the role of an MP, a chap who visited the constituency occasionally but spent most of his time in Westminster. Which I do think is a weakness of the old system. I'm very close to my constituency for all sorts of reasons.
Come to that point in a minute. Let's take Josh's point up, which is the last question. Can you give a specific example of how you have helped the constituents because of your ability to speak in government or to speak to government?
Well, I can't specifically give you an issue, and stop me if this isn't the sort of thing that you want. We had a dramatic problem with knife crime in my North London constituency. We were unfortunately seeing young people stabbing each other, and in many cases we had something like and I may have it slightly wrong, 13 teacher deaths in less than 13 months. And there was clearly an issue. And during the election, I knocked on the door just by chance on the door of a lady who that morning had buried her son, a really talented young man. And she just, I was horrified. I'd knocked on her door, but she stopped me. She wouldn't let me go. And she just said, this constituency needs someone to stand up and do what they can in Parliament, even if it means changing laws, but improving education and actually tackling this sort of knife crime. When we got elected, the government, who had wanted to bring in legislation that, and whether you agree with this or not is actually in this case not really the point, wanted to bring in legislation that actually carrying and using a knife in a threatening fashion would carry a mandatory prison sentence. As I say, whether we agree with that or not is not the point. I did, as it happens. However, the government, it's difficult to implement or something. And we're not going to fully implement it and not implement it for people under the years of 18. And as I said, we had teenager on teenager. And clearly, legislation and punishment part of the solution, only part of the solution. And I managed the law by enhancing the support of the local community, taking petitions to Parliament, encouraging youth groups who was against this abhorrent crime more than most people I met, got them to meet ministers, held a debate in Parliament, and then got the newspapers on board because I knew that they would probably carry more influence than me as a back. And we changed the law. So that's a classic example. And in fact, many MPs go through whole terms in Parliament without actually changing the law. And that was one out of two that I managed to get changed.
How does an MP feel when he or she goes through Parliament and hasn't managed to change the law? Do they look back as Enoch Powell did and say all politicians and their careers end in failure?
It's very topical you asked me that, because I was having a conversation with an MP this morning, and we both had this deep sense of frustration, which is that I don't think there are any MPs who come into Parliament and in a frame of mind but to do anything better than improve the quality of life or the lot of their contemporaries. But there are an awful lot, I think, who leave feeling that they may have made a contribution, they contributed in debate, they may possibly have influenced change, but it's very hard to be able to put your name to a law that you might have changed. But what you can do is put your name to a cause. And being an MP, if there is a cause, it could be I'm going to a conference I'm chairing on cancer after this meeting, or shortly after this meeting, on a particular type of cancer, some of the problems that are faced. And actually, an MP can help break down the doors that lead eventually to change. So I don't think it's about failure, but I think we have to manage our expectations pretty quickly when we get in.
That's a big problem, isn't it? I find dealing with MPs, that is the big critical part, managing expectations. And for some, that becomes a real difficulty. And they sort of retreat into some sort of self-protection, some sense of self-importance, without realizing the power they could have or the influence they could have, i.e. they don't always know the difference between influence and power.
Right. Yes, I think so. I think you also have different circumstances pushing MPs, and I'm not talking about the executive and the need to become a minister here. I think the one job that we have to remember, and we all make this mistake, is that for the very best of intentions, you actually want to pick off quite a few issues, quite a few, whether it's about through legislation or just through causes. You want to pick off a lot, but you can't. And you have to discipline yourself early on not to overreach yourself, because you will achieve nothing and will feel intensely frustrated. The problem is, what do you say no to? And trying to explain why you might not be pushing a certain issue. And the actual answer is quite simply, if you take on too much, you will do it ineffectively and have less chance of success.
let's look at some of the questions that are coming up because they relate to some of the things you're saying. I suppose some of the things you're saying is that we need a new settlement in the United Kingdom about our democracy. Many of us would agree with that. And some people have raised quite a few points about that. For example, John has raised a question from Andrew Miller saying, do you think the power of the legislature should be devolved more? I mean, you already talked about local government. We don't have local government in this country. We have central government, which has local administrative units, unlike Sweden, which has real local government. Do you think we should devolve the functions of the executive much more than we do?
I am a great believer in what is fashionably called localism. I do have one worry about localism, though, is that the democratic engagement at a local level is really very, very low.
Well, we're waiting for him to come back. If you would like to put up some more of your questions, I've got quite a few still that have come in from Canterbury and others to ask, but please feel free to answer them. And I know, Sean, you're trying to get something on geoengineering, but really, I suppose this webinar is about, democracy and the democratic system and how we can improve that. And I'd love to do a webinar sometimes on the subject you're interested in, and I'd love to talk to you about it, and maybe we can get that question in. If you can answer some questions, ask some questions on democracy, then that's fine. You should be able to type it in on shared notes, Joe, and if you can't, type it in this box and I'll try and put it up for you, okay? And that should be okay. Nick has gone out and he's coming in again. He uses a laptop. When we had Andy Love, he used his Office desktop computer, which was much better. But this time we're having a little trouble with his own link, but we'll see. Anyhow, I'm going to put your link up, Joe, on the shared notes, as you can see. So if anybody wants to have shared notes, they can put it up. I presume that's a link to the book, Joe, that you had it before. Welcome back.
Yeah, sorry, I think it's David Cameron, and I was against the Snoopers Charter, and I don't know if he and Theresa May actually got it through, but they must be watching what I'm saying.
I like the way you go away, Nick, and come back and carry on as if you hadn't disappeared, which is really quite good. Okay, I mean, some other people will ask other questions as well about what you might call the resettlement of British democracy. Ollie Fawcett again from Canterbury has talked about the House of Lords itself. What role does the second chamber have? I mean, can that play an important role? And what role should it be? Should it be elected? Should it be selected? How should it be a body of the regions or of local government? How would you see the House of Lords playing a role in a new settlement?
Well, let me put, and then give me a chance to explain myself. I voted against the reform proposals that were being put forward by the coalition government because I felt they were fundamentally flawed and they misunderstood what I think is an important constitutional role of the House of Lords. That is not to say I do not believe it should not be reformed. I think we should kick out the crooks. We should have time limited. There are things that we can do with the second chamber to make it that much better. But the reason I think the first question we have to ask before we talk about reforming is, what do we want from a second chamber? And I can see that's exactly what some of the people are effectively saying. I believe it should be a revising chamber. I do not think it should be a second elected chamber, because I believe that will lead to constant conflict between the two houses. We know that the House of Commons is supreme. We know that it is accountable, and we know that ultimately it sets the laws. To have a second elected chamber will mean a second level of representatives. The proposals that were put forward 2 years ago were effectively going to give people the right to be elected, the right to claim a mandate, the right to say that they speak in our name, but they would have had no constituents and they had no accountability. So I think there were big flaws in that. What I want is a house of experts that is prepared to challenge what the Commons comes up with, but ultimately accept that the Commons, through, for example, the Parliament Act, if necessary, has the right as the elected chamber to pass the bills it chooses to do so. That's fundamentally where I'm coming from. And I just leave you with this thought. It is entirely possible that someone like me, who has a very good, inadequate experience of, say, military matters, could stand up and make a speech in the House of Commons and probably go relatively unchallenged by my peer groups around me. But I would hesitate to make such a speech if I was in the House of Lords, where there are former chiefs of defence staff who know a lot more than me about legislation matters we might be proposing. So I think we have to we get a right balance if we have a revising chamber full of experts from lots of different subjects against an elected chamber that is ultimately supreme.
So you're in favour of holding in check the power of the executive, but you don't want to devalue the role of the Legislative Assembly and the MPs.
Sorry, could you just repeat the last part of that?
You are in favour of checking the power and the role of the executive and giving good advice to people who legislate, but you're not in favour in diminishing in any way the importance and the value of members of Parliament.
No, because I think the answer to that is I want one elected chamber. I mean, I'm a low state Tory. I don't want more and more reams of elected government. But apart from that, I think two elected chambers will bring conflict, not advice. And the good news is that if the British public do not like the government they have, they can kick it out. I would not like a situation where they might kick out the government and the executive through, if you like, at the end of the Parliament of the House of Commons, but we're still left with a House of Lords that was proposed to run for a much longer period and actually didn't have the accountability that we had in the House of Commons. So no, I believe we should be held to account by the British public, but it should be one chamber.
Again, Ollie Fawcett and other people have argued that the more you appoint people, presumably if you appointed people to the Cabinet weren't in the House of Commons, or you appoint people to the House of Lords, you have real problems of accountability. How do you ensure accountability?
Well, I don't think anyone should be appointed to the House of Commons. I think the House of Commons people should be elected, and they should hold any executive appointments to account. So, for example, it's an interesting point here. At the moment, if you came into politics for a career, which I did come into politics for a career, your only career choice is to be a minister. I'm submitting papers and arguments that say we should open up other second career avenues, and we should start looking at actually making a career out of select committee, advancement to select committee chairman, make this a worthwhile career. Perhaps, I put it out there, perhaps even pay members of select committees more money if they're elected by their peers, so they are not beholden to the executive, but have this alternative route of holding the executive to account. But to do that, we need people from diverse backgrounds. I want to see more service personnel in. I want to see more teachers. I want more people from all different backgrounds, both their ethnicity as well as their professional background or not professional background. That's the key.
We'll come back to select committees in a minute if we've got time, because I think that's a really important part of the equation of reform. But let's take questions, because quite a few are coming through. Sean, for example, says, OK, MPs are important, but do we have too many? I mean, if you compare lots of other legislatures with ours, we have 630 plus MPs. It's a lot of MPs.
I think it's a very, very good question. And on the face of it, I can see why it's attractive. And I would have said before being elected, I think it was Sean who said this. Sean, I agree with you. The only caveat I would put in now is that actually, if we still expect MPs to do the constituency role they do, that to a number of MPs would mean increasing the number of people they represent represent. And I think the public would have to consider, would they tolerate more salaries being spent on staff to help meet a bigger constituency, so as not to dilute the time? And actually, would they get better constituency MPs if they broaden them? There is a case for doing it. I'm not saying no by any means, but having done the job for 3.5, nearly 4 years, I would say that we'd have, one of those things would have to give.
Andreas comes back to the issue of local government as well, and he said, you know, we lost you when you were talking about localism, and he's asking the question, okay, localism is important, but why is it such a low turnout? Our electorate's not really interested in localism. How can you make it more interesting that they can be interested in it?
I think we've got a democratic problem generally emerging with, for a number of reasons, people switching off from politics. And that's been shown by a drift to the anti-political parties, as much as it's been shown in a reduced turnout as well. So against that background, I think local government still faces that political disengagement problem. Having said that, for years, local government elections have been relatively low turnouts. And it is put like this, and obviously I knock on a lot of doors. It is simply because there is no direct relevance seen between what a council does and what goes on in people's lives by a lot of people, not all people. And ironically, a council that has millions and millions of pounds of budgets has more direct influence on the quality of life of those it represents than in many respects an MP does. So it is a big deficit that is only explained, I think, by the fact that we don't work hard enough to show what our councils do and what they are responsible for. And that, again, is fundamentally a communications exercise, but the role of the councillors as well. Sadly, very rare. I'm in a London borough, so we have wards. Each ward has 3 councillors, which is too many in my opinion. We have 3 councillors. And actually, if you ask people to name their councillors, you'll be lucky if 1 in 30 can do that.
John again is putting the question from Andrew Miller from Christchurch, Canterbury, and he refers to Bercow, the Speaker's letter to party leaders about PMQ's Prime Minister Question Time, which he is worried that it's getting too boisterous and it's bringing the House of Commons into disrepute. Is it partly that it reflects the adversarial nature of British politics in the House of Commons, and that we need to change it and make it a more deliberative chamber rather than an adversarial chamber, and we should give backbenchers a much bigger role in it, especially in PMQs?
Well, first of all, contrary to popular theory, I'm quite a fan of John Bercow as Speaker of the House of Commons for one reason only. And look, like everyone, he has his faults. But he is actually very, very good at getting backbenchers time and the time to ask their questions and to effectively hold the executive to account. One of the reasons PMQs overruns is because he's determined to run through the whole list of MPs that have been called for question, plus give free hits, which I can explain later stage if you wish. But even in the question times that are not televised so often, when it's just to each department that comes up once a month, so every day we're holding a department to account, he gives the backbenchers a tremendous amount of time, and that's a good thing. Specifically, until about 6 weeks ago, I was always mildly irritated when John Bercow would stand up and say, "Oh look, you stop behaving like schoolboys because the country don't like this." And yet every week the visitors gallery is heaving with people who only want to come and see the adversarial nature of the leader of the opposition and the Prime Minister going at it hammers and tongs. But I do think we crossed the line, and there was one particular week which I thought we did. Actually, John Bercow's really caught the mood of the country on this one. I think people are saying, it's perhaps gone a little too far. I'm not so sure everyone wants consensus. I'm not a great believer in consensus politics because I used to live on the continent and I saw some of the repercussions of that, as well as some of the good things. So I think we should keep our chamber, which confronts each other, holds us to account, and works very well, but perhaps not so well on the PMQs days, which I suspect there'll be no structured change, but I think the temperature may change and drop a little.
Stephen Ridley takes us back to the discussion we had with Andy Love about the party system. He's saying that don't we have at the moment in the House of Commons the relationship between government and MPs, a command and control system, and that is put into effect through the party system. And what we really need is to get rid of the party system in the way we've got it at the moment, because it's no longer fit for purpose.
Is that the get rid of the party system, were you saying?
Yeah.
I think the party system is going to remain simply because I think we'll always want an agenda for government. I could be wrong on this, but one of the biggest complaints I get as a result of coalition government, stopping me on the doorstep and saying, you said in your manifesto you would do this, you would get out of Human Rights Act, is a very common one because it's very topical. And I say, well, yes, that was in the manifesto, but actually we didn't win the election, so a cosy little deal was put together by two parties, and that went. And there's that sense of incredulity that, hang on, you came to the country and you're in government, but you're not delivering. And cynics amongst you might say, well, that's pretty normal. But actually, think about it, only a party can really put forward a programme of government unless everyone accepts that we're all going to come together after the election, after the people have spoken, and get into a room together to stay. And that's why I think the party system will survive.
I think what Stephen is saying, and it's reinforced by one of the students from Christchurch, is that the party system isn't so much nowadays about having a manifesto with very clear, distinct differences between the parties. It's more a way of controlling the MPs. And James Eyre talks about it's a problem that some MPs desire progress, I guess, through their careers, and are therefore fearful of going against the government consensus. And so the party system, rather than being a liberating system of choice, it's become a controlling system of consensus.
Yes, well, of course, that's pretty true, a lot of that. I think it's worth looking, though, and realising that this Parliament has been the most rebellious Parliament ever. We have had major foreign policy turned over because 50 MPs did not vote for military action in Syria along with the opposition. We had a government policy that was not going to have an EU referendum, but 81 Conservative MPs said there should be, and that was enough to change the government's mind. So the party system, in some senses, has been turned on its head a little bit, because if the Prime Minister of the day doesn't feel he's able to carry his party with him, then either the policy, if it's forced to a vote, or withdrawn before a vote comes. So in some senses, I think the supremacy of the party, and in some ways this is to the credit of the Prime Minister who's listened to his party, has actually both been challenged and proved to be effective. But I don't think a ready alternative to a party system. Even those that do not like the present political structure are in a party, such as UKIP, which is much less about Europe and more about we don't like politics.
Okay, we've got an interesting question coming up, which takes us into the select committees. And I mean, select committees we hear a lot more of lately. We've had some really good select committee meetings televised in the House of Commons, and we've seen people like Keith Vaz and Margaret Hodge play a very, very prominent role, and so they're very important. The question, again, from Christchurch is why it's from Ollie Fawcett, in fact, why are select committees ignored by the House, by Parliament, not by Parliament, by the government too often? Why aren't they given more of the light of day? Why aren't their recommendations taken seriously? And if they come into conflict with what the ruling party wants, the whips take over and the select committee takes back seat. And yet the select committee should have more power as congressional committees do.
I've sat on 2 select committees. I'm currently on the Justice Select Committee, and before that I was on the Public Administration Committee. You're quite right. The Select Committee, whilst it has the power to pretty much summon anyone it likes before it, it actually only has the power of reporting to the House of Commons how much it disapproves of policy or an issue. It does 2 functions. It will look at pre-legislative issues, so it can be formally asked by the government to say, will you please look at our proposed legislation and make recommendations? This doesn't often help, and what we do is if we're given sufficient time, we will examine legislation and we will make recommendations. And actually, some of those recommendations do get taken up, but I don't think I've ever known a case of when they've all been taken up. And that tends to go through quite silently and not very controversial. Where it's more controversial is a select committee might actually look at an issue that's happened, such as transforming rehabilitation, which is all about trying to reduce the reoffending rates of those who are held in custody. And it may challenge quite aggressively the government system. It might say, we warned you and you didn't listen. But actually, it is inevitable that a government will rebut most of that rather than listen to it, principally because the policy is in place. You might get modification. Why is there no mechanism for forcing the House to take action? Well, it's quite simply because the House will always make its decision by voting on something. And you can't force a House to come to a conclusion, and you can't force an executive to accept it unless the House votes for it. And obviously, if the legislator are fused together, which means that's just not going to happen.
I suppose a lot of people get frustrated, though, because when they see a select committee, they often see tremendous consensus and unanimity between the parties on the select committee. I mean, they agree with each other so often in the recommendations they make. Then when it gets into the chamber and into the hands of the whips, suddenly disagreements begin to emerge again and there's conflict. And so that consensus is somehow being destroyed.
You did break up quite a lot there. I think I got the gist of it. Yes, there does seem to be consensus when you're on something comes from a select panel. But one of the curious things about our parliamentary behaviour, when an MP sits on a select committee, he rarely sits there as a party representative. He sits there as an MP who's on the Justice Select Committee. And it is not at all unreasonable that if a controversial report comes out, that if there's not a split opinion that divides on party lines, or any lines, but divides, that you will have a member of a select committee choosing to vote, maybe against the government or maybe against the opposition, depending on what they're looking at, to reflect his view on that select committee. And it would be extremely unlikely for all whips to try and make a member of a select committee vote another way.
Ollie,
and of course, he's only 1 or 2 votes out of a majority of 50.
Yeah, Ollie and Stephen's gone back to the second chamber point as well. I mean, Ollie argues that if you have a solo executive legislative body, a unicameral system, in other words, and you increase the democratic deficit within the UK, And Stephen says, well, if you have two houses, wouldn't it be better for the second house to be one based upon localism? In other words, it's a house based upon local democracy, representative of local democracy, and that would allow the Athenian principle of direct democracy to be expressed more easily in a national framework.
I think I understand where you're going. It reminds me a little bit of what the Americans did with their Senate until 1913, I think it was, where the state legislator would elect its representatives, and then they would in turn send two people who were not elected by franchise to go and sit in the upper house of Congress. It was only in 13, I think, that they introduced direct elections for that house. I think that is that. Am I right? Is that the sort of point that's been made?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're breaking up a little.
Again, I would prefer to devolve down, and I would prefer that if you like, to achieve localism, to achieve more representation locally, where we cover so many of key functions, I would rather devolve down to a more empowered local chamber than actually give it to a second chamber, a more senior chamber at a national level. Because I think one thing about about the idea of localism and going into the country, we know London is completely different from the northeast. We know the southeast economy is about 75% of the whole country's economy. We know that a one-size-fits-all, therefore, is something that's difficult to deal with. I'll give you a really cool. Is that as part of the welfare reforms, we actually set in place a thing called a benefits cap, which was set at the average salary for the country, the average income, which was £26,000. Now, actually, that's considered a very low amount in London, but actually above the average in or northeast, I think it is. So again, there was a one-size-fits-all, and that led to another debate whether we should actually have regionalised local pay. Now, I'm not suggesting at this stage we devolve welfare and reform and welfare level, but I think my point is that true localism works, I think, because each area is fundamental, or each region certainly is fundamentally different.
Caroline raises an interesting point about localism. It's often said the British system is not a separation of powers one like the American one, and it works on a system of checks and balances, as a whole series of checks and balances, and many people have argued recently that those have been eroded away. And Caroline mentions one of the erosions, that if you try to have localism and you want checks and balances at the local level, the local press is very important. But we've seen the local press go in decline over many, many years, and it's not as powerful as it used to be even 30 years ago. Yeah. And we're finding even the national press is not providing the checks and balances that it once did. And so, we have a problem there. So Caroline raises this point about the demise of the local press.
Yeah, Caroline is spot on, and I'm really pleased that she's identified that. If you like, the fourth estate, the free press, is the fourth separation of power in some ways, and locally more than ever. One of the things I am really proud of that the government have done is that they have introduced transparency in, for example, expenditure at a local level. But there are reams of information that gets published at a local level. And the way that the local press are basically under to run as businesses, it is almost impossible for them to actually scrutinise local activity at a local level. So in many ways, on one hand, and this is a great example, we've improved transparency, but there's very few people who are actually looking. And the local press would do a really good job of that. I was actually horrified, and I may be at odds with a lot of your people online here today, I think that the local press is actually very much at risk from the statutory underpinning come about as a result of the press regulation changes, which came to a vote in the House of Commons. Everything that was done, and I don't want to go down there, I was breaking the law anyway, and people should have been prosecuted. Some were and went to jail. We've now introduced this concept of statutory underpinning, where the politicians, if you like, put local press out of business. I was one of 15 MPs who voted against that because I thought it was a real thin edge of the wedge. Now the local press has got to change. It's got to come more online. It's got to come more interactive. I think it still needs to fulfill its functions as a community press, but it's vital it remains as vibrant as possible. In Enfield, I've got this, and believe me, they're very vibrant, and that's a good thing.
Joe raises the question that worries lots of people, that people out there in the electorate and community groups and civil society are indifferent to conventional politics. They don't necessarily need to engage with politicians in the way in the 1950s when you would have a hall full of people at a public meeting and 90+% people voting at general elections. There is this engagement. How do we square the circle? How do we get people engaged in a way that will make them think that politics is important again in the conventional sense?
It's a very good question, and it's actually a massive threat to democracy, particularly in the so-called developed democracies, as a result of such disillusion with behaviour of politicians, with the financial crisis, that we're actually, at the moment, if you're a politician, you're onto a bit of a hiding to nothing, but that's short-term. The long-term threat is disengaging democracy. My fear is that with the understandable disengagement with democracy, and yet with such strength of feeling out effectively in the public on issues that are prevailing in a time of relative austerity, that any renewed surgence in interest in politics will be either to the far left or the far right. And that's something all of us as Democrats should be very, very... there is no magic wand. I've learned this. I've had more doors shut in my face by people who are, I hope, not necessarily saying I'm rubbish, but are basically saying you're all rubbish. And that is something that you can't turn around in one parliament. You've got to do it by more transparency, more openness, by the politicians, sort of thing we're doing today. You've got to effectively be able to make it that much more relevant to people. And my fear is that what goes on in Westminster is not seen as relevant. And the democratic deficit has got so large that they therefore feel there is no point investing their time. Final point, the EU, I'm bashing about the EU, although I probably could. The EU, its fundamental problem is that it has a massive democratic deficit. There are no real democratic institutions. Decisions are taken far removed from a voter. And what's actually happened, rather than people rising up and politically engaging and trying to change things, they've just gone to hell with it. And there's only 30% of people at best voting on these issues. All I've got to do is continue my appeal, is seize the moment, capitalise on the strength of feeling, and get engaged in a political system to change it.
Okay, clearly you are. We're getting very close to the end now, so I'm going to sort of sum up and maybe ask you one last question. But it's clear that you believe that we need to do a great deal to actually change our democracy, recreate our democracy in a way, and that we've got to look at all of our institutions. Do you actually see that happening? Can you see in any of the parties, can you see amongst your fellow MPs, a political will for that to happen in a major way that could make a real difference? Or is there just a lot of tokenism going on, just tinkering with the system? I mean, do we need a root and branch change? And is that likely to happen?
I think the English-speaking people generally, and I mean this around the world, understand and value the type of democracy we have, which isn't just about who we elect. It's about our common law systems. It's about effectively the separation of powers, which effectively have survived hundreds of years. I still think those principles are going to survive hundreds of years, and I think what we're is one of those periods when actually it's not good for Parliament or good for democracy. My fear is that we will not quite bite off the end of the apple that needs biting off to make fundamental reform and change. And I don't think that will come about unless we see a significant change in political engagement where that change is demanded. The final, and what do I mean by that? Look, it's not about taking to the streets as they did when they fought for democracy in the Middle East. It's actually about the re-engagement with the political process, the parties, or through campaign groups for change that will make the politicians change. Why? Because we answer to you for yours. And at the moment, I don't sense the thirst for change is out publicly. And it's currently just go away, all of you are horrible. Well, I think we're here to stay, but I'd rather we weren't horrible and we were forced to change to become the sort of politicians and political system you want us to be.
Okay, thank you. I mean, and that's a really good point to end, that the change to happen, it's not just about politicians, it's about the citizens and the electorate out there. And activists may want change, but there may not be a taste for change beyond that. There may be cynicism, but moving from the cynicism to wanting to be active to change is a major step, and one we still may have to go through. Anyhow, thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
I think you were as open and transparent as you always are, and that's been great. And this we will send out to everyone who's expressed an interest in this webinar. It's been streamed, and obviously students have been involved in it as well. And I'd like to thank Christchurch Canterbury for being involved, and we're hoping to do this in the future on a Wednesday when you've got a big class and we'll have a great group of you. How we will handle the questions then, goodness only knows. I hope we've managed to deal with most of the questions. I'm sure we left one or two out, and I apologise for that, but we dealt with most of them. So thank you everyone for taking part. We'll stay on for the people who joined us for another 15 minutes if you want to network with each other. But I know, Nick, you have to go because you have this conference. And I want to say thank you again. It's been a very worthwhile webinar to do.
Thank you all, and thank you, Francis.
Okay, thanks.